is my dirt bike canopy. In this episode, we'll be starting with a CAD design and taking it through to near completion. We've got a heap of design, fabrication and testing throughout. So strap yourself in for an exciting episode, or don't, like this design here.
And we're giving away this Kincrome 1043 piece toolkit, so stay tuned for details on how to win. We begin at the CAD of the dirt bike canopy, which took about 4 weeks of my time on the computer. There's another episode on my channel which helped me form the basis of this design. It features 2 separate sides, a pull-out spare wheel holder, as well as a slide mechanism for the dirt bikes. It will be bolted down to my flat tray and have legs which will enable it to be lifted off. I've opted to make the canopy out of aluminium as it's lighter and I really enjoy working with it. So with that in mind, here's the frame made out of primarily aluminium unistrut as well as some RHS sections. The build begins here, first day of construction, and I've got my materials pre-cut. Now, I'm using a lot of unistrut for this build. I've had a heap of questions on where I got my unistrut from, and that is Valley Steel Sales. They're a local business, so shout out to Rob and the team down there. All my steel and alloy is sourced from there as well. I've also got all my laser cut bits as well, and we'll talk about them in detail as we install them. The first job is to put some miters on the unistrut, which are going to form these diagonal lengths here. So I'll get on the bandsaw and cut all them. Now that all the miters and straight lengths were done, I could start assembling the frame. I'd be constructing the frame on the floor, and once I'd checked it for level, I began marking everything out. This first section would form the headboard frame. Once I was happy with it, I began tacking. In an ideal world, I'd like to have a big welding bench so I could clamp everything down, but I don't have the space for one, so I'm just making do with what I have. As there would be a flat sheet of aluminium flush up against this, I ground back some of the welds. I then future-proofed the canopy wiring by punching holes in the unistrut, and you'll see what I mean when we come to wire the canopy. I was using Kincrome's new stepper drill bit, which worked a treat. Now that the headboard was welded off, I started to assemble the rest of the frame. It was time to test the newly constructed frame on my tray. I could see straight away that it had pulled when it welded and it wasn't flat, so I began the persuasion process. Yep, my DIY Cybertruck was taking shape. While it was on there though, I measured everything and it turned out my headboard was 5mm out of square. In hindsight, I should have welded it while it was clamped to the tray, but you live and learn. Now I just had to get on with it and straighten it. Hitting it didn't really do anything, so I moved on to phase 2 of straightening, which involved a ratchet strap and a hammer, which unfortunately had limited success, so I moved on to phase 3 of aluminium straightening, the trusty old worn 8274 high mount winch. And we're square, you wouldn't read about it. And we'll just quickly make it level again. Now that the frame was complete, it was time to move on to the sheet metal skin. I wanted my canopy to be sealed, which meant a reasonably complex series of return folds to accommodate the pinch weld and rain gutters. The triangular shape definitely tested my CAD skills, and I took hours getting these panels right. I'd used a similar return design to my Canopy, which I'd built with ACF, and there's a full build series on my channel if you're interested.
4 weeks in CAD, and we get to start finally cutting today. Nested up my first one, got my cut list here, and all of my drawings. These ones here, the doors, and that back panel. That's where it starts getting complicated.
There were 7 sheets of 3mm alley that formed the skin of the canopy, so the plasma table had its work cut out. No pun intended. Once the sheets were all cut, I headed down to see my mate Jezza at Kraken Engineering, who specialises in 4-wheel drive snorkels and metal fabrication.
2.5 metre, 8 tonne Armada press.
Yeah, changes your life.
Pretty much.
Jezza and his 80-tonne press were about to make my flat pack sheet metal into usable parts, but first he had the unenviable task of deciphering drawings from an engineer.
No backstops, you bastard.
If I'm perfectly honest, some of these returns are pretty complicated and there are not many people I trust to do this sort of work. Jezza has over a decade experience on the press brake and can fabricate basically anything as well, so make sure you check Kraken out if you have any fabrication needs. But for now, cue the folding montage. I was making Jezza work for it today. Given the number of parts and the variety and size, it guaranteed for a plethora of tool changes, but it didn't seem to faze him.
We're up to the piece I'm most nervous about. Jezza isn't phased. This is the headboard. So it's a 5-fold return. And we've got to fold there, 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 and there. And we got one shot. Otherwise, I've burnt a couple $100 in aluminium sheeting, right, Jezza?
Thanks, mate. Pressure's on.
It was finally time for the last fold, and if this was right, I'd have a headboard.
We stuffed up the headboard fold. It didn't quite get on the backstops. It's a really intricate piece and we didn't quite get it right. This is the first time Jeremy folded it, first time I've folded it. And I guess you can see here that it's probably about 3mm out. Super good. Another 100.
Yet another trip to the plasma table. I was chewing Jezza's ear off about barras and two-strokes the first time we folded the panel, so this time I shut up and we got Jezza's mate involved because the panel was so large and awkward to handle.
We just finished this panel for the second time. We stuffed it up again. Jezza's folded it perfectly, but I think it's a CNC issue. I know we've been having problems with the rollers on the CNC machine. And they need new bearings. I don't really know whether I want to recut and fold this for the third time because it just feels like we're burning money. I think we may have to improvise, adapt and overcome. And I think I've got a bit of a plan.
Let's get to that plan later though. It was finally time to put the panels on, but before I could do that, I had to deburr them and sand them back. When aluminium is cut on the plasma table, it causes porosity and it has to be sanded back before it's welded. So I got busy sanding back all my panels. My disc of choice is this stripper wheel from Former AU, which is a local business, and after having tried numerous methods, I've found this to be the most effective.
Went to put the floor on for the first time, and these checkouts should line up with this uni strut. I marked these lengths the wrong way around, so I'm gonna have to cut and shut all of these.
It's so much fun undoing your hard work. I could barely contain my excitement. Love it. After they'd been cut out of the frame could be put back on the tray, and you can see here the 20mm SHS packers I was planning on using as a foundation for the canopy. A test fit of the panels showed that they needed a little bit more profiling before they could get welded in properly. I used clamps and window packers to get the frame into a position where I was happy with before I started welding off the floors. I did the same at the front as well, although it'd have to come off later and get welded from the underside.
Good news, the clamping system worked in the end. It probably cost me an extra half day. Obviously, if I did it again, I'd do it differently, and I would have just started by clamping it onto the tray. But by basically a bunch of finessing with the aluminium, we managed to get it.
And just like that, the floor was in. You'll notice the slots I cut out of the flat panels line up with my Unistrut frame, so I can easily bolt in things for the interior fit out, which we'll cover in the next episode.
Now it's time to put the structural supports on for the dirt bikes. So you can see here these slots, they're for the structural supports, and I'll show you the supports right now.
I'd opted to go for 5mm laser cut and CNC folded aluminium for the structural supports. They had notches in them for the aluminium RHS, which would tie into the Unistrut either side, which would give the lateral rigidity while cornering. I completed a stress analysis on the frame with FEA, and while I could probably make a whole video on my assumptions, the long and the short of it is that blue is good, and there was a lot of blue under a 2G bump loading, which meant the design was all in the clear. I was able to use the roof sheet, which had matching holes for the bearing carrier, to line it all up and make sure everything was in the right position before I welded off.
Fair bit of TIG welding in this, but I can confidently say she's not going anywhere.
And just like that, the other side was done as well. Then I could start welding off the underneath as well as some verticals. There sure was a lot of TIG welding in this project, and I was absolutely loving it. I'd like to say a big thank you to the viewers out there. There was a heap of engagement on the last video, and there were so many good ideas in the comments. One of the comments that stood out suggested I use the foot peg holders to clamp the bikes down to the canopy. It resounded with me a lot because it really meant that you didn't have to worry about the bearing tolerances on the slide. So what I'm doing here is welding some foot peg holder brackets in. The foot peg holders bolt through them later on in the video. With both of them welded on, we can put it back on the car now.
Eat your Wheaties.
Starting to look more and more like a dirt bike canopy. I was really looking forward to getting the roof panels on and the doors as well, because then it would really start taking shape. Due to my earlier incident, I was absolutely paranoid about it being square as well, so I was constantly checking, and the good news is for me that it was in square still. Turns out the canopy had to come off again. One of the disadvantages of using Unistrut is that depending on the orientation, it may not have that much weld surface like this joint here. I wanted this joint to be particularly stable for lateral movement, so I designed up this little corner gusset which required welding in. While it was off, I realised I could bolt the floors together and weld them down to the Unistrut as well. These Unistrut spring nuts made it relatively easy to pull the floor down before welding. I busted out the spool gun from MIG to do some small stitch welds on the floor. I'd never used it before and couldn't quite get it to look as nice as a TIG weld, but it was perfect for this situation and super fast to use. The floors had pulled up really well, and I'd also welded on the door handle return. Now it was time to sand everything back before sticking on the roof panel.
We're up to a really exciting part. We get to glue on the panels, so it may look like it's a fair way from being completed, but actually I think we're on the home stretch. We just got to glue these on, do a couple of tacks, and Bob's your uncle, we'll have a dirt bike canopy.
I was using trusty old Sikaflex for this. I could have stitch welded from the bottom, but generally this leaves ugly marks. I was super careful not to put glue near any welds. I was able to use the bearing carrier to clamp it down in the middle, and we'll be looking at this design later on in the video. The roof panels were all clamped up now, and it looked as though everything had pulled up okay. I then punched some holes through the floor of the canopy to bolt it down to the tray. I was planning on adding some crush tubes later when it was a bit easier to access. Once that was all done, I could start welding off the roof. Now, let's get onto this pesky headboard. But before we get into that, I've got an exciting announcement.
Kincrome and I are teaming up to give away this Tool Armor 1053 piece toolkit. This is the exact same one that I've had in my shed for the past 2 years, and it's an awesome kit. So one lucky winner is going to take this home. I can't wait to see it in someone else's shed. All you have to do is subscribe to the Kincrome YouTube channel, subscribe to the Design and Built channel, and buy a piece of Design and Built merchandise.
All right, back to the headboard.
Can see that it doesn't line up, and I can't handle it.
Instead of recutting and folding for the third time, I'd opted to make it into 2 pieces. While I'd lose out on a little lateral rigidity, I could compensate by adding some cross braces in the middle section, which I was intending to do at a later stage. Although it was more work to make it into 2 pieces, all of this was actually a massive silver lining because I'd be able to look out my rear window and see the bike. This meant I'd be able to check that they were hopefully still there and they weren't moving around, which I think is a better design overall. The returns on the headboard are pretty hard to get to, especially when it's on the car, so equipped with a short back cap of my TIG, I did it before I stuck it all on. Everything was lining up pretty well, which was a huge relief to be honest. I just had to pull in some panel gaps and then weld it off. With both sides welded off, I could move on to the rear panel. It was really starting to look like a DIY Cybertruck now. I just had 2 more panels to weld on, which would form the inner walls. These panels were slotted so they tied into the uni-strut, giving the canopy more strength, but also making it easy to manufacture as I could locate the bottom of the panel with ease. It would require a lot more welding though, and the canopy would have to come off again so I could get to the bottom side. With everything tacked and stitched into place, I could start doing a full pass. And I must admit, I was a little nervous on this one. I did try and make the roof and side panel one piece, but unfortunately it wouldn't fit on a single sheet of aluminium, which meant I was stuck with this 1.8 meter long weld. I'd be putting a lot of heat through it, so I was worried about warping. At this stage though, it was as well supported as it possibly could be, so I put my lid down and got on with it. Turns out I was worried about nothing and it didn't warp in the end. I pulled the canopy off again so I could completely weld off the bottom. I added some crush tubes, and once that was all done, I could finally start on the slide mechanism. and it's much the same design as I had previously. There's a whole build episode on this on my channel, and I'd recommend you had a look at that if you're interested to see how I got to this design. Rather than cover this construction in depth, I'll just cover some key points and the differences between my original design. In short though, I'd made everything 50mm longer to accommodate different types of dirt bikes, which meant I had to make another 2 sleds from scratch. The sleds were constructed out of RHS and laser cut bits. The bearings used a 16mm piece of RHS to roll on, so they had to be made quite accurately. I used the MIG to tack, but I welded off the bearing surfaces with a TIG to maximise the surface area for the bearings. I was really careful with the welding sequence here, so I didn't end up with sleds shaped like bananas. And once I had all the rails welded up, I could drill holes for the extension hinge portion, which you'll see later on. I could then start getting the rails into position to form the sled. One of the big design changes I'd made was making a groove in the rear wheel tread plate to ensure the rear wheel ended up in the same spot every time. You can see that here, and I also got these ribs laser cut and CNC folded, which would give that tread plate extra strength. Yeah, nah, she wasn't going anywhere. And once I'd confirmed that confidently, it was time to weld off using a mixture of TIG and MIG. The other major change I'd made was lengthening the pulley system. For those playing along at home, this would take it up to the 4th iteration of pulley system on this sled. I'd made this change so it wouldn't foul on the pulley shroud, which was necessary to keep water from going through the top of the canopy. Then the carriage tops could be welded in. And once the extension latch pivots and extension pivots were all welded in, we had a finished sled. Here's a comparison to the old version, and you can see the differences in length, rear tread plate and front pulley design. Now I just had to make the extension, and it was a very similar process to before. I did, however, decide to cut up the old sled and save some material and time. And after 10 seconds in YouTube time, I'd finished the extension as well. The extension now had a channeled tread plate running the whole way along it to match the sled. Once I'd completed the other sled, I gave them all some etch primer to avoid rust. Once the pulleys were on, these were now ready to be put on the car, but they needed some bearing carriers to go on first. Cue the newly redesigned bearing carriers. Previously, I had 2 L brackets, but I decided to move to a U shape to keep the tolerances internally resolved. And what I mean by this is if my canopy manufacturer was off, it wouldn't matter as much with a U-style bracket compared to 2 L brackets where it could easily get out of alignment. After the lateral bearing tabs were welded in, I could begin bolting up the bearings. You'll notice some supports were unfortunately missing, which meant another trip down to the plasma table. They could be added in later. After I filmed the last video, I found the plastic was peeling off the bearings, so I switched to this different style which was harder than before. You can see there are more bearings near the start of the carrier as well, which was to spread the load when the bike was close to the end of the travel. I was really enjoying the auto mode on the Kincrome impact wrench for this job, which basically meant it would do one ugga dugga and stop, meaning that I wouldn't strip the threads on the 200 odd bearings I had to do up. All of the Kincrome power tools are coming with a lifetime warranty for a limited time only, so make sure you go check them out if you're in the market for a new set. As well as launching power tools, Kincrome had launched a new line of power tool accessories like hole saws and drill bits, which I'd been testing for the past few months. Pretty stoked with it all so far, and I'll keep putting it through its paces. Yep, that is a hell of a lot of bearings, and these came with different tolerances to the last set, so I was taking a stab in the dark again. Would it work? Watch this space. Okay, time to install them on the car. Each bearing carrier was bolted down with 16 M12s and had 90 bearings. Onto the front wheel carriage now. It's a very similar design to last time, only I'd added more bearings and a tab for a carriage lock, which we'll get into later.
Just finished assembling this carriage and it's not looking good. You can see here, it barely moves. I'm actually dragging the whole thing, whereas this is the old one. And the old one glides nicely. So unfortunately, I have to get this re-lasered. I don't quite know what's wrong. I have upped the thickness to 5mm, but I'll have to check the drawings and check whether it's an incorrect fold or an incorrect design.
I had to, in fact, get it cut and folded another 2 times. I messed up on the drawing the first time, and the second time was a manufacturing error. Third time lucky, as they say, hey? Ooh, we're on here. Now to the front wheel holder. Someone in the comments of the previous video suggested I use the Ballard's Moto Clench, which is something I didn't even know existed. This is a strap-free front wheel holder that worked with an over-center lever. I'd previously tried to design my own because I didn't want to use tie-down straps, but I'd had limited success. I just needed to punch a hole through it for the winch rope and then I could bolt it all up. You'll notice I've got slots in the design so it's much easier to assemble as well. Before I could assemble anything else, I needed to mount and wire the winch. For this, I needed a winch mount, and I'd designed this up in CAD to not only be a winch mount, but a triangular gusset of sorts to give the canopy strength so it wouldn't turn into a pancake. I was particularly happy with this design as it served more than one purpose. I'd sent it all out to get laser cut and CNC folded, and I needed a mirror version of it as well, since the pulleys weren't centered. I'd opted for captive nuts over nutserts here, given how catastrophic a failure could be, although I was probably being a little bit pedantic and nutserts would have worked just fine. I was using an ATV winch again, despite it being slow, although I was considering overvolting it to 24 volts. Every time I get a die grinder out, it's a reminder that I probably should have slotted the holes in the first place. I would say you live and learn, but I should have probably learned 100 times by now.
Oh, great success.
Winch is now all mounted up, and I'm planning on adding a shroud over this pulley later once it's all tested. You can see here the uni-strut is coming in handy once again for a clearly well thought out and executed battery mount. And here's some of my finest wiring on display as well. I've just done a quick job so I could test out the canopy. We'll be delving into a full fit out with proper wiring later on. Finally, I could start assembling everything. I was a little nervous because of the new bearings and tighter tolerances, but it was looking good so far. It was millimeter perfect, until it wasn't. Nothing an angle grinder can't fix though. And it seemed to be working well after a low profile bolt head mod. I'd beefed up these latches and the extension was now looking solid.
Both of these sleds and carriages are on. We're getting really close now, super exciting. Obviously I can't fully test them because I hit my roof. Problems of having a small shed, but we're going to do the foot peg holders now.
These foot peg holders were an off-shelf product from Risk Racing with a mechanism that worked by putting your weight down on it. With a small mod and a touch-up spray, they suited my canopy perfectly. They came with these base plates to screw down into, but I wanted some more adjustment, so I laser cut these new plates and then began the tedious task of tapping 40 holes.
So I made all these plates, as I kind of explained, and then on CAD, it looks like the holes are fairly far away, but realistically, moving from one of these holes to the next is not that much, so I probably just tapped half of these holes for nothing. Thanks for coming.
Remember these mounts from earlier? Well, now I could drill through the canopy roof and bolt the foot peg holders down through them.
Yeah, mate, she's not going anywhere. How good's that?
I had to make one final piece before testing this canopy out, which was the carriage locks. These were designed to be a redundancy in case the winch rope failed. They were meant to automatically lock in as the carriage went up the travel, which is an idea I got after it happened by sheer fluke the first time.
Not intentional, but that just locked itself.
This design was a little bit more robust though, and I was keen to see how it went. I'd forgotten to weld in the bracket initially, so I busted out the TIG again.
Lock!
Excellent news, the mechanisms were ready to test. One more thing though, I wanted to bolt the doors on for a visual representation before it went out in the wild.
Putting a Jezza to work here. There's a couple of tricky folds, like this corner. You ever tried to fold a triangular canopy door before?
Never tried doing that.
Probably first and
First
last.
time for everything, mate.
The doors were particularly painful to make due to the amount of tooling changes caused by the triangular shape. These were far from finished as they'd have to have bracing welded on the inside, which we'll cover in the next video. Shout out to BLR Procurement for the hinges and the whale tail locks, which came with a CAD model that I used to get the cutouts in the doors right.
How good is that? We're going to load two bikes up and see how they go and see how stable this thing is and see if I need to make any design changes before I paint it. Let's do it. All right, so I've made this 200mm longer, but I do have bigger tyres on my car. I've got the bigger Goodyear Boulder Wrangler MTs, and I didn't account for the size of them again, obviously, and it's still not quite long enough. So what I've got to do is make this even longer, probably only another 100mm this time. But for now, we're just going to use these wooden planks. There are a heap of changes with this slide mechanism, and this is one of them. Now I have these eyelets here just in case it's not so stable, but this is the first time I'm testing it, so I'm really interested to see how it goes. Okay, so you basically just have it like that. Previously, I've had a carriage latch on it, and I don't have that this time, which is something I probably need to add in, which is another trip to the plasma table. That goes like that. That pulls the bike really quite well in, to be honest. Yeah, that's pretty good. So now the foot pegs have to go under here, the foot peg holders, and the carriage lock should actuate as well. So George, if you could kindly send it. Stop. You can see, I reckon we're 10mm out. This needs to go about 10mm higher. So what I'll do for now, this is the hard part, actuating these foot peg holders. I just wanted to see whether they were going to be stable or not. And then if they are, I'll come up with a different solution. Yeah, that's on. The bad news is these are super hard to actuate. The good news is, she's not bloody going anywhere, mate. All right, let's put the second bike on. So this is the first test of another type of bike. I didn't test another bike on the jig, so it will be interesting to see how it goes. Realistically, the only bike worth owning is a YZ, so I'm not really sure what you do with one of these, but nah, they're all right, I guess. This actually works a treat. Like, it's a little bit awkward. I think if the carriage stopped coming up, which I can solve, I know how to solve that, then it'll be a pretty good user interface. It works. First drive, how do you feel about it?
not entirely convinced you can do it on your own, but as you said, there's still a few more things you got to sort of play around with. So that's us being honest, yeah?
Yeah. And I think it's like the last 10%.
Last 10% is always the one that takes longest.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how the car goes for stability. So we'll give it a go.
All right.
We just had the first test of the dirt bike canopy and it went really well overall. I'm really happy with the structure. I'm really happy with the way that the bikes are held down. I think that this foot peg holder is going to require some sort of ratcheting mechanism, and that's a big design project in itself. There is still a mountain worth of work to do left on this build. I've got to do the spare tire rack and a full fit out on the interior, as well as actually finishing the canopy structure and getting it painted. So make sure you hit subscribe and tune in for the next episode. I'm not really sure when it's going to drop, but it'll be done when it's done. I have some unique ideas, kind of like this one, that I can't wait to build. The projects will take months of development, so hit subscribe and I'll release the videos once they're ready. Thank you. So really exciting toolbox raffle happening at the moment, and if you buy a piece of merchandise and subscribe to the Kincrome and the Design and Build channel, you go in the chance to win that raffle. I don't think there's actually going to be that many applicants, and it's a 15K toolbox. So make sure you buy a piece of merchandise. These Sandy Top hoodies, pretty great during the winter season, which we're in the middle of right now.